Ladies and gentlemen, I want to talk to you tonight about something that may seem confusing, even painful at times, but I want you to know it is all part of God's plan. Have you ever felt alone? Have you ever walked through a season where it seemed like the world turned its back on you, where friends disappeared and the doors you were knocking on refused to open? Maybe right now you're in that season. You're praying, but heaven seems silent. You're searching, but the answers aren't coming. But I want to tell you something tonight. God hasn't forgotten you. No, my friends, He is preparing you. The Bible tells us that before God blesses, He often isolates. He takes you away from the noise, from the distractions, from the things that are holding you back, because He is about to do something greater than you can imagine. Look at Moses. Before leading Israel, he spent 40 years in the wilderness. Look at Joseph. Before stepping into his destiny, he was thrown into a pit, into prison, into isolation. Even Jesus himself, before stepping into his ministry, spent 40 days alone in the desert. So if you feel alone right now, don't despair. God is not punishing you. He is positioning you. He is shaping you, strengthening you, preparing you for the blessing that is coming. And when that moment comes, you look back and realize that the isolation wasn't rejection, it was preparation. Can I get an amen? When God isolates you, it is not to abandon you, but to prepare you. Many times in life we go through seasons where we feel alone, misunderstood, or even forgotten. We look around and wonder why the people we once relied on are no longer there, why certain opportunities seem to have dried up, or why the things that once brought us comfort no longer satisfy us. It is in these moments of solitude that God is doing His greatest work in us. He pulls us away from the distractions, from the noise, from the influences that could cloud our judgment. And He brings us to a place where we have no choice but to rely fully on Him. When we study the lives of great men and women in the Bible, we see a common theme. Before God used them in a mighty way, He first separated them. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before leading Israel out of Egypt. Joseph was sold into slavery and thrown into prison before becoming second in command over Egypt. David was anointed king but had to endure years of hiding in caves before he sat on the throne. Even Jesus, the Son of God, spent 40 days in the wilderness, fasting and facing temptation before. When God is silent, it does not mean He is absent. There are times in life when it feels as though heaven has shut its doors, when our prayers seem to go unanswered, and when we are left wondering if God is still working in our lives. These moments of silence can be some of the trials are not meant to break you, they are meant to build you. Every great story of faith is marked by struggle, hardship, and moments of deep uncertainty. When God is preparing someone for something greater, He allows them to go through seasons of testing. These trials are not meant to destroy a person's faith, but to strengthen it. They refine character, increase resilience, and teach reliance. Rejection is never the end of the story when God is in control. It often feels painful, discouraging, and confusing when doors close, when people walk away, or when opportunities slip through our fingers. But what seems like rejection is often God's way of redirecting us to something greater. Many times we hold on to things that are not meant for us, relationships that hinder our growth, or plans that fall short of God's perfect will. When rejection comes, it is easy to question our worth or to wonder why things did not go as expected, but God sees what we cannot see. He knows what is ahead, and He knows that if we stayed where we were, God's timing is always perfect, even when it does not align with our own expectations. There are moments in life when we feel ready for a breakthrough, ready for a new opportunity, ready for a change, but nothing seems to happen. The waiting season can be frustrating, and doubts can begin to creep in, making us question whether God has forgotten us. But what we must understand is that God is never in a hurry. He operates outside of time, seeing the end from. There are moments in life when everything around us seems uncertain, when the path ahead is unclear, and when we feel as though we are walking in complete darkness. It is in these moments that faith is truly tested. Faith is not built in times of comfort and ease. It is forged in the fire of trials, in the moments when we have no choice but to trust in God, even when we cannot see what He is doing. The process of being isolated, tested, and refined is not easy, but it is necessary for growth. When God allows us to go through seasons of uncertainty, when God calls someone to a higher purpose, He often strips away everything that could hinder their growth. This process can be uncomfortable, even painful, because it requires letting go of things that once felt familiar and secure. Many times people resist change because they fear losing what they have, not realizing that God is making room for something greater. Growth requires pruning, and pruning means cutting away what is unnecessary so that new life can flourish. When a gardener prunes a tree, he does not do it to harm the tree, but to help it produce more fruit. In the same way, God removes what is not beneficial so that we can become who He has called us to be. Moses grew up in Pharaoh's palace, surrounded by luxury, status, and power. But before God could use him to lead his people, Moses had to be stripped of everything that tied him to his past. He was sent into... There are times when God allows everything familiar to be taken away so that we can fully depend on Him. It is human nature to find comfort in routine, security in what is known, and stability in what feels predictable. But when God is preparing someone for something greater, He often disrupts their comfort to shift their focus from earthly reliance to divine trust. This process is not meant to punish, but to deepen faith and sharpen spiritual awareness. Elijah was a prophet who experienced this firsthand. After boldly declaring a drought in Israel, God led him to the brook Cherith, where he was fed by ravens and drank from the brook. It was a place of solitude, a place where he had no one but God to rely on. Then suddenly the brook dried up. What once sustained him was no longer available. It may have seemed like abandonment, but in reality, it was preparation for the next step in his journey. God then sent him to Zarephath, where a widow was assigned to provide for him. This shift in provision was a test of obedience and trust, demonstrating that God's ways are higher than human understanding. When everything familiar is removed, it forces a deeper level of dependence on God. The Israelites, after leaving Egypt, wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. They were stripped of the comfort of Egypt, even though it had been a place of slavery. In the wilderness, they had no choice but to rely on God for daily manna, for guidance, for water from a rock. They could not lean on their own understanding because everything about their journey required faith. Had they remained in Egypt, they would have missed out on the promised land. Paul, before becoming one of the most influential apostles, experienced a season where everything he knew was taken from him. He was once a Pharisee, highly educated, respected, and powerful. But when he encountered Jesus on the road to Damascus, everything changed. He lost his status, his position, and even his physical sight for a time. He spent years in preparation before stepping into his calling. What seemed like loss was actually gain because he was being repositioned for a far greater purpose. This principle applies to every believer. When God removes the familiar, it is often a sign that He is making room for something better. It can feel like abandonment, but it is actually an invitation to deeper faith. It is in the moments of uncertainty that trust in God is strengthened. Instead of questioning why things are being stripped away, the response should be to seek God's direction and trust that He is leading to something far greater than what was left behind. Jesus Himself demonstrated this principle. Before He began His ministry, He was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. He fasted for 40 days and was tempted by the devil. There was no comfort, no familiarity, nothing to rely on except His relationship with the Father. This season of isolation prepared him for what was to come. It was in this time of testing that his strength and obedience were revealed. If the Son of God had to go through this process, how much more will His followers? Sometimes when everything familiar is stripped away, it is because God is calling for a new level of obedience. Many people want to step into their calling, but they resist the process of surrender. God cannot fill hands that are already full. He cannot lead a heart that refuses to let go of the past. When He removes something, it is not to harm, but to make space for what is necessary for the next season. It is easy to trust God when everything is going according to plan, but real faith is built in the moments when nothing makes sense. When Abram was called to leave his homeland and go to a place God would show him, he had no roadmap, no guarantee, only a promise. He could have chosen to stay where he was, but had he done so, he would have missed out on the blessing that God had in store. Faith requires stepping out, even when the path is unclear, trusting that God is leading with purpose. The process of being stripped of the familiar is not comfortable, but it is always intentional. It teaches dependence, deepens faith, and prepares for greater things ahead. God is never careless with the lives of His people. If He allows something to be taken away, it is because He is making space for something far greater. Everything God does in your life has a purpose. When He isolates you, He is not punishing you. He is preparing you. When He is silent, it is not because He has abandoned you, but because He is working behind the scenes. When trials come, they are not meant to destroy you, but to strengthen you. When rejection happens, it is not to break your spirit, but to redirect you to something better. When you have to wait, it is not wasted time, but a divine process where God is aligning everything for His perfect timing. When you are stripped of the familiar, it is not to leave you empty, but to make room for something far greater than you ever imagined. God has a way of turning pain into purpose, isolation into elevation, and trials into testimonies. What you are going through right now is not the end of your story. It is just the preparation for the blessing that is coming. Stay faithful, stay obedient, and trust that the same God who led Joseph from the pit to the palace, the same God who turned Moses from a fugitive into a deliverer, the same God who called David from the pasture to the throne is the same God working in your life today. So do not grow weary. Do not lose heart. The season of isolation will not last forever, and when God brings you out, you will step into something so powerful, so incredible, that you will look back and realize that every tear, every lonely night, every unanswered question was worth it. Because God was not punishing you, He was preparing you. And when the time is right, He will release His blessings over your life in a way that only He can. Keep the faith, because your breakthrough is coming.